So welcome, everyone. I'm Margaret Keith, and I'm a member of the Windsor Essex On Watch, aka WOW. And tonight we're going to find out more about an issue that has many Ontarians upset and angry: the creeping privatization of many aspects of our healthcare system. As many of you know, this is the eve of an unprecedented province-wide referendum on healthcare privatization, and we encourage all of you to vote. It's simple. You can vote online at publichospitalvote.ca or in person at a polling station near you. You'll hear more about how to do that shortly from Patrick. And we just want to remind you that this event is being recorded, so you can access it through the WOW Facebook page or on YouTube. This gathering is sponsored by WOW, which was launched over a decade ago on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. We recognize that all of Canada resides on traditional unceded and/or treaty lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful for their ongoing care, respect, and love of the land, air, and water that we now share. And we endeavor to actively support the calls to action put forward by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're planning to keep tonight's event to an hour. You'll have a chance to ask our speakers questions in writing via the Q&A, which you should see probably at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to write in your questions as they come to you, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And now Jim Brophy will introduce our first speaker. Jim?
Thanks, Margaret. Well, it's a real pleasure tonight to introduce Mike Hurley, although I think he needs very little in the way of introduction. He is arguably one of the most articulate and well-known advocates for our healthcare system and for the workers that work there. He's president of the almost 35,000 members of the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions, OCHU-CUPE. He has warned of the erosion of our public healthcare system for decades as government funding failed to address the deep systemic needs of our system. I personally watched as he advocated for healthcare workers during the pandemic as they faced some of the highest rates of infection of any occupational group while being denied protections that they so desperately needed. And Michael has sounded the alarm and demanded change over deteriorating conditions at work to the point that healthcare workers now face some of the most, the daily threat of violence, making their workplace one of the most dangerous in Ontario. We are very fortunate today on the eve of this public referendum regarding the erosion of our system to have Michael with us to share his perceptions and ideas about this important and needed engagement and receiving this needed engagement and public attention. Michael, welcome.
Thanks so much, Jim, for that very kind and exceedingly generous introduction. And it's so meaningful to me coming from a great activist like yourself. So thank you for that, Jim. And I want to thank very much the great activists at the Windsor Essex On Watch for organizing this timely community meeting on the challenges facing our healthcare system in Ontario, and especially the challenge of healthcare privatization. And my hat is off to the activists who have led such a spirited campaign against a new private-public partnership hospital for Windsor, located so far from the population that will use it. That new hospital epitomizes many of the challenges we will be talking about tonight. Excuse me. The first thing we have to acknowledge when we look at Ontario's healthcare system is that it has endured decades of austerity that has left it with the least capacity of any hospital system in Canada, and the second least of any long-term care system in the country. In terms of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, only one other country has less capacity in terms of its hospital system. This planned and chronic underfunding has been matched by the rise of an aging and growing provincial population, creating a capacity crisis in home care, long-term care, and in hospitals. Rationing has been the government's response. It is very difficult to get home care. It is very difficult to get into long-term care, and only the very sickest patients get into hospital. Increasingly, eligibility requirements and reduced lengths of stay are typical ways in which the system copes with a finite capacity and a growing need. When the baby boom generation was born, society built schools and universities and expanded capacity in hundreds of ways, but neoliberalism has pushed back hard between the 1950s and now. What faces us now is a moral choice. Does everyone deserve access to high-quality healthcare regardless of income? Even though money is tight and private delivery is much more expensive, government after government in Ontario has been committed to expanding the role of the private sector. You would think that just 2 years after losing more institutionalized seniors to COVID than any other jurisdiction, 75% of those deaths occurring in for-profit long-term care homes, that our provincial government would not dare to contemplate, let alone expand, private delivery beyond long-term care into hospitals. But in fact, that is exactly what they are doing. You might think that it would be seared into the public consciousness that while a skeleton staff of caregivers wore garbage bags instead of gowns and lacked the basic equipment like N95s to work safely, while the residents in their care were housed together regardless of whether they had COVID or COVID symptoms, while many residents died of dehydration and neglect, such that the army needed to be called in to provide care, and that the for-profit operators of these long-term care facilities were taking out hundreds of millions in profits and executive bonuses while 8,000 long-term care residents perished. You would think that this would be burned into our memory. But sadly, it hasn't been. And now, after the dust has settled, some of the worst offenders with the highest death rates are being rewarded with 35-year contract extensions. And the great majority of new long-term care beds are going not to the not-for-profit sector, which had such a better record during the pandemic, but to the for-profit chains. This Conservative government has a long history of former premiers Davis, Harris, Eves, chairing major long-term care chains. And there's a long history also of senior managers in the ministries of health and long-term care going on to rewarding careers in the for-profit chains, and of the executives of the for-profit chains taking very senior positions in the ministries and in Ontario Health. This government is ideologically committed to private delivery. In its approach to the immunization against COVID, choosing to deliver the lion's share of those immunizations through for-profit pharmacies, it gave us a glimpse. In its willingness to ignore the deaths by neglect of thousands of seniors in wretched conditions while the operators sucked out hundreds of millions in profits. In its movement of hospital surgeries to for-profit clinics, despite all the evidence showing higher costs, higher death rates, worse outcomes, undermining of staffing levels in public hospitals, and of the financial operations of smaller rural hospitals. I regret to say, it appears to me that to this government, patients are profit centers. Hospitals and long-term care facilities are markets, and there is a tremendous and effective corporate interest in opening and dominating these markets. Death rates in private hospitals and private clinics are higher on average by 2% than those in public hospitals, according to a study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Death rates are higher in private hospitals and private clinics because owners skimp on the use of regulated staff and find other economies, like diluting blood cleaning products in dialysis, for example, that compromise the quality of care while increasing profits. Often not constructed adjacent to emergency facilities, these private surgical centers are not designed to deal with a patient bleeding out in an unexpected medical event. Outcomes are less successful and costs are higher, over 30% higher for the 5,000 cataract contracts recently announced for Hurley Corporation in Ottawa, for example. The public hospital will receive $450 an eye for cataracts. The private owner will receive $650. The costs of private delivery in hospitals of surgeries are 150% higher, according to a comprehensive recent major study released last month in Quebec. While the real operating budgets of public hospitals have been cut, including this year by $121 million, spending on the private surgical clinics is mushrooming in Ontario. They are over their budget allotment. Commercializing hospital surgeries is a top priority for this government. This, even though it is known from the experience in the United Kingdom, Australia, and other jurisdictions that private delivery lengthens rather than shortens wait times. And this, even though it is well documented in those jurisdictions that the growth of for-profit surgeries skims off the easiest to perform procedures, leaving the public system to deal with the more expensive, time-consuming, and more complex procedures without any advantage of the economy of scale. For rural hospitals like Leamington and smaller hospitals like Sarnia, many of the surgical procedures, hips and knees that they perform now will ultimately be sucked into surgical centers in major urban centers, undermining their ongoing viability. And these private surgical centers will compete with public hospitals for staff. In Ottawa, nurses and clerical staff are being offered twice their salary, yes, twice their salary, to staff up the new for-profit surgical centers. The impact of this is that these staff will be unavailable to work for the Ottawa hospital, which, like all public hospitals, is in the grips of a staffing crisis. In Ottawa, in Ontario hospitals, there are currently 37,000 vacancies, and there is an annual turnover rate on top of that of 13%. This is not a system that can sustain competition. When the public sector staff are prevented by law from bargaining more than a 1% increase in compensation in each of 3 years, while the private sector is not covered by the legislation and can offer double salary to work. The workforce is demoralized, sad, anxious, guilty. It's impossible to do the job for patients that they need and deserve. Workloads are impossible. Salaries are being cut in real terms. Violence is common. Injured workers are just thrown away. During COVID, we were unable to get the province to accept that the virus was airborne. It changed its policy to determine that COVID was not airborne in the face of an equipment shortage, and healthcare workers were denied the basic equipment they needed, like N95 masks, to let them work safely. Ontario's high rate of healthcare worker COVID infection and death was preventable, and healthcare workers know that. Feeling unsupported, many people are just leaving jobs in healthcare. 158 emergency rooms closed temporarily in 2022, according to the Toronto Star, driven by the staffing shortage. Minden Hospital in Halliburton is being closed permanently, ostensibly due to staffing shortages. Services like birthing in communities like Smiths Falls have been closed temporarily in the face of the staffing shortage. The courts have struck down the legislation that imposes the wage ceiling, but the government is appealing that decision. It's in this context that the deliberate understaffing in our hospitals, the degraded compensation for the workforce, the impossible workloads, the unsafe working conditions should be viewed. We know that this government is using the current weakness of the public hospital system against it to privatize the backlog of surgeries and diagnostics. We know that this may be a road from which there can be no turning back. And so we meet tonight, resolved to defend our public hospital system from the latest attempt to privatize it. We do that with a strong sense of history that reminds us that we stopped the privatization of cancer care and of ambulance services in Ontario under the Mike Harris government by mobilizing in communities across Ontario in the 1990s. We can and will do it again. We have in the Ontario Health Coalition the finest and most effective public Medicare defending organization in Canada. The OHC and the Windsor Health Coalition have a great action plan, including the referendums which are underway. Your energy, your activism and enthusiasm, your patience and discipline, your ties to your neighbors, your profound belief in the justice and equality of a public healthcare system that allocates care based on need and not on the ability to pay. These are the real resources we have. You can count on the people who work in our hospitals to be on the front lines, fighting alongside you as we push these privatization plans back together. If the Ford government believed it had the support of Ontarians, it would not have announced this privatization policy in the summer months. It is afraid of a fight on this issue. Our job is to give them that fight and to continue it until the end of the next provincial election and beyond, until we wear them down and wear them out. We have the capacity to do that. It's vital that we leave here tonight committed, each according to our capacity, to do what we can to battle to preserve our public hospital system in this province from privatization. This government seems powerful and intransigent, but we can and will push them back. The Ontario Health Coalition's referendums are a huge beginning to that battle. Let's make the turnout in the Windsor area huge. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And we just want to remind people to put your questions into the Q&A if you have questions for Michael. And what we're going to do is hear first from Patrick, I think, and then we will have questions. Yes, Catherine, I think you're going to be introducing Patrick.
Yes. As we all know, the Ontario Health Coalition is having a referendum this right now ongoing, and in Windsor there's locations tomorrow and Saturday, and where you can go in person or you can vote online. Patrick has been involved for 15 years with the Ontario Health Coalition. He is currently the co-chair along with Tracy Ramsey. During his travels while serving aboard a U.S. Navy submarine that introduced him firsthand to social inequalities outside of the United States. Later, with his partner, he settled in Windsor, and together they served on medical missions in Asia and Central America. Patrick saw firsthand how proper public health care is a vital part of a safe and thriving community. And now, Patrick, please continue.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And thank you for joining us tonight. I appreciate the opportunity from Windsor on Watch and the good work that they're doing in bringing this to light. There are a couple of things that I was born in the US. I lived the first 28 years of my life there before I moved to Canada. And one of the things that I have had no health insurance. I have had a PPO. I've had an HMO. I've had a PMP, a number of different health insurances that are available in the States. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because, you know, some Canadians, some Ontarians enjoy great auxiliary benefits given by their employer, such as Green Shield or something similar. And, you know, it's very helpful, and they think that, hey, insurance is okay. Let's take a look at what that does. In the US, the entire medical industry, and we're talking about pharmaceuticals, hospitals, insurance companies, device manufacturers, providers, salespeople, the healthcare industry in the United States, it profits hundreds of billions of dollars every year. That's a huge, huge market. I look back at Reagan, Thatcher, and Mulrooney when they came in 1980. And Ronald Reagan, as he was entering the White House the first time, was carrying a book, Capitalism and Freedom by Morgan Friedman, Chicago School of Economics. And this economic theory is to privatize all public services, that the private sector can do it far better and far cheaper than the public sector. Well, let's take a look. In Canada, we spend $6,000 to $8,000 per person every year on healthcare. In the US, it's $15,000 to $16,000 a year per capita. Does that mean that the US healthcare system is that much better, that it deserves that much more money? No, it's profit. It is profit going to stakeholders. I have nothing against profit. I have my own pension investments. It comes down to the morality of those investments. Do I want to financially profit off of people's illness? Yes or no? When I was with various health insurances over in the States, fortunately, I didn't run into any long-term care issues or have major medical problems. But when I did, there was the copay, the deductible, and my insurance company made decisions for what kind of care I could receive. Right now, I can't even say that anymore. Before Bill 60 was passed, our doctors made our medical decisions. They decided which tests were necessary according to OHIP guidelines, and they prescribed that course of care. Bill 60 that was recently passed not only opens the door to the privatization of our clinics, our hospital services, it also does a lovely thing with all of the staffing shortages. The Minister of Health can now deem people appropriate to be a doctor or appropriate to be a nurse or a PSW. They can deem people without the qualification. So ask yourself if you want to have care provided to you by people, you know, it'd probably be okay. Not to degrade any professionals who cannot get the Canadian qualifications, et cetera. That's an entirely different story. What we're talking about right now is the privatization of our services and the opening of private clinics. What is that going to specifically do to our healthcare system? I don't know. You know, service is provided by people. So when we open up private clinics, where are the doctors, nurses, and administrators going to come from? In the public sector, with the public hospitals, we have, as Michael pointed out so well, chronic underfunding, staffing shortages, and recently the most horrific burnout from the pandemic, not being properly equipped in order to handle it. So you have people who have been underfunded, overworked, and just completely burnt out. And where are they going to go? Hey, they're going to go off to, you know, some are going to go to these wonderful private clinics. That removes those staffers and puts them into the private system. So then that further depletes our public system. It's going to make things worse. And this just, it's setting the stage for complete privatization of our healthcare system. Bill 60 has done this. One of the issues here is that this was not an election issue for this government. They never put it in the campaign literature. It was never debated. It was never discussed. The people of Ontario never had the opportunity to choose which government they wanted based on those policies. So the Ontario Health Coalition, in concert with the 38 coalitions across the province, have launched the largest referendum that we have ever. There is online voting available, as well as I think the most voting stations that we've had. The last referendum that we had to have, unfortunately, with long-term care was about 10 years ago. And this time around, people are becoming involved. People are becoming interested in trying to find out what's happening. And this is an incredibly powerful time for people to have the opportunity to vote for that privatization. Do you want it or no? That is the question that we are asking through the Ontario Health Coalition. One question: do you support the privatization of our public hospitals? Yes or no? We are collecting those votes securely online. We are collecting them in paper ballot form with the most secure means at our disposal by being a volunteer-led and funded coalition. It would be great if, you know, we had the funds to do more, but we are providing. Going to publichospitalvote.ca. People can not only vote online, but also take a look at where the closest voting station is to them and get the hours of operation there. We're pushing for the paper ballots specifically because it's a very good visual. It's something solid that we can show to the government in our lobbying efforts to say, this represents one ballot, one person, a voting system that we have enjoyed in Canada and wish to preserve. So hopefully we can get a number of paper ballots, but certainly if you can't get out to a voting station, please vote online and have your say. With that, I thank everybody, and I do have see if I can share my screen real quick here. And it's not listed here. Oh, lovely. Okay, so go to publichospitalvote.ca to find the voting location nearest you or to vote online. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Patrick. And that was very interesting, very informative. And I'm going to be fielding the questions from now onwards. I have 2 questions so far. So if anybody else has any questions you'd like the panelists to answer, please post them in the Q&A tab and I will bring them up. The first question was actually one that you've just answered, Patrick. Can the voting station, the polling station locations and times in Windsor be listed? And I was going to quickly look them up to see what the times were. Do you have at your fingertips what the times might be for the voting?
It depends on which location. I really have to say that in trying to find suitable locations that are accessible to people, we had a very difficult time to do so. And the biggest challenge that we faced was folks not wanting to quote unquote piss off the MPPs. I don't understand why the current Ford government would be opposed to having an open democratic vote when this was not an election issue. They should actually welcome what the will of Ontarians is. So the times range between 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. tomorrow. And then on Saturday, again, between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. We do have voting locations throughout, mainly in Windsor, but we have a number of voting locations also out in the various parts of the county. And looks like I can, here we go. Good. So Friday, we have 2 main voting locations. The first is the Labor Center at 3700 Somme Avenue, which is just west of Central. And of course, Somme Avenue is south of Tecumseh Road. That's where we're going to have the drive-through voting available Saturday from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. The Chapter 2 brewing will start both days approximately at 2 o'clock and last until 6 o'clock. So I encourage people to go to the website and see those, to look up the polling locations. So thank you.
Thank you. And then I have a question for Michael, and it's a clarification question. Jane asks, I heard our first speaker, Michael, say that the private clinics pay less to their staff, which enables them to increase their profits. And then she thought that she heard you say that they were paying double to add to their staff, thus decreasing the staffing of public hospitals. Can you please clarify for her?
Yes, what the Canadian Medical Association Journal article showed was that the operators of private surgical centers skimped on the use of regulated health staff. So it was the numbers of, for example, registered nurses on staff in a dialysis unit that they would reduce in order to increase profitability. So I wasn't talking about wages in that instance, but Ottawa is a great example of the competition for labor. Obviously, there's a significant shortage of nursing and other staff in all the hospitals in all areas of healthcare in Ontario. And in Ottawa, the private operator for hips and knees has offered the nurses and clerical staff who currently work in the department where surgeries are done double time to work on the weekends to staff up their facility. So that's an example of how the for-profit system undermines staffing levels in the not-for-profit sector. And of course, the Ottawa Hospital, like all hospitals, has difficulty staffing on the weekends. So these people are being removed out of the staffing pool of available, workers. So it's a significant blow to them. Yeah. I hope that answers it.
It answers it for me. I hope, Jane, if that makes sense to you, it's certainly a mystery to me, a complete mystery how if we have shortages today and we're sucking stuff out of the hospitals even further, how this can possibly lead to an improvement of the current crisis.
And in fact,
So-
the fact that the Ford government has done nothing to address any of the issues related to the lack of capacity or the demoralization of staff in the hospital system, or to do anything about the attrition problem at all. The only thing that they've done is announce, basically deregulation of the processing of the qualifications of foreign trained staff. But in terms of anything meaningful with respect to any other measures, we haven't heard a word from them aside from the creation of these private clinics.
I have a follow-up question. I'm just thinking about something that I've heard in the community. It wasn't a question that somebody's posted here, but it seems that there's sometimes some confusion as to if we have private delivery of public health care today, how is that different than what is being proposed with the privatization? I tried to explain it, and I'm not sure if I've been able to explain it. So, Michael, you're much more familiar with the language, and I think this is maybe something that you could put into words for people to understand what the fundamental differences are if we already have private delivery of public healthcare services.
Well, we have a couple of private hospitals. We have the Shoulder, which does hernias, and of course, it only does the simplest hernia procedures. But in terms of surgical procedures generally, these are performed currently in the public sector, and cataracts is a good example. Everything the Health Coalition has researched, and it did original research calling all of the private clinics that do cataracts, and found that extra billing and upselling were features of those facilities. In other words, trying to persuade people who are a little bit vulnerable, because as a patient, you're reliant on the advice of your doctor on their advice, and if they say that a certain lens would be better for you, even though it's $1,500 more expensive, you're likely to take their advice. So there's upselling, and then there's also the costs. In Ottawa, the Hurley Institute will get about a third more per eye than the Ottawa Hospital would receive for the same procedure. And of course, the Hurley Institute is not interested in doing cataract surgery on diabetics or anybody with complex medical conditions. What they want are people that they can move on to some sort of a medical assembly line, right? Leaving the Ottawa Hospital with the more complex cases without the easier, less time-consuming cases to compensate for that. So they'll receive much less money. Like what, how does that compute? So I mean, to me, this is how it plays out. And of course, as it expands outwards now into hips and knees, you'll have similar issues, and it's very concerning.
Yeah, you mentioned the Schuldeis hospital, and one thing that I understand is that you have to stay overnight there. So this is a surgery that's typically done as a day procedure in our existing hospitals, but if you go there, you have to pay for all the additional costs of staying overnight. which obviously makes it much more expensive. I think if you've got insurance that's paying for it, you might not mind one way or another. But if you're paying for this out of your own pocket, it can add up, and it means that getting the procedure done at the shoulder becomes much less affordable for people who don't have insurance. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, thank you for clarifying that. We have another question from somebody who is anonymous. Can either Michael or Patrick explain why it's so crucial to hold this voting process for privatization? And I think, let me pass it over to you, Patrick. You've been speaking more about the actual referendum.
The way that now the Ontario Health Coalition has been around for decades. We've been able to successfully lobby various governments of all colored stripes to do what's best medically for Ontarians. A prime example of that was in getting the Royal Commission on the SARS epidemic back in the 2002, I believe it was, that we were successfully able to push the government to launch that investigation. The way that the Ontario Health Coalition, the Canadian Health Coalition, lobbies and tries to get better healthcare service for people is showing that, hey, there are these people that are interested in the outcome of these discussions. So, you know, politicians, the nature of the beast, they listen to people who can carry, you know, a lot of voters along with them. So when we're talking about having a couple of 100,000 votes through this referendum to keep public health care, the government will listen to that. So far, we've had very little success in meeting with the government representatives. Personally, down here in Windsor, I've attempted to meet with the new Conservative MPP in Windsor-Tecumseh, and have not been able to, I haven't received any replies to my emails, and when I call, I've not had one callback. Lisa Gretzky in Windsor West, we have fairly regular meetings on healthcare issues, and that's not an issue. So hopefully, with getting a large number of votes to keep public health care, that will empower the Ontario Health Coalition and allow the Ford government to listen to what the people decide. That question was not put forward to us in the last election. It was not an election issue. So we're bringing it up now for the people to vote. And if you want privatization, that is an option. This is a democratic vote. You have your right to say. Let's find out what the people of Ontario want.
Thank you, Patrick. I have a really interesting question from Kathy, and I'm going to ask you, Michael, because you are in Ottawa. And the question is that the federal government does not believe in this. So what is the chance that they will withhold funding to the province?
Well, I think the federal government's response has actually been very weak on the privatization initiatives in Quebec and British Columbia and Ontario. I didn't take a lot of comfort from the Prime Minister's, you know, remarks. You know, I think they said that they would watch, you know, but you know, the federal government has, you know, managed to avoid responsibility for much of the carnage or whatever that they have brought about by significant funding cuts, over the Martin and Freccia and Harper government's years, the response of the federal government to privatization initiatives by the provinces has been unfortunately weak. But this service is delivered provincially, and in provinces like Ontario, we have had success in the past in turning back privatization initiatives, whatever the thought process of the federal government was, relying on them to enforce the Canada Health Act, or I think is hoping for too much.
So is there something that you suggest or recommend that we do to get them to provide a stronger response, or do you think that?
Well, I think we should train our attention on the provincial government. They're moving into the pre-election cycle in Ontario. We have a provincial election, I think, in 26. This is the beginning, the kickoff of a period of intense campaigning around public delivery of healthcare services, and hopefully not just for hospitals, but also, what's going on in long-term care is just a heartbreaking tragedy and a scandal, which shouldn't be allowed to perpetuate. So it's a pushback, which we can do.
Yeah. Well, we've got the questions coming in hard and fast now. So Doris is asking, will OHIP end up paying more per hospital service for the private for-profit hospitals than to the existing public hospitals? And so this, of course, is a question about how the funding works. We've had a little bit in the media. I don't know if Michael, Patrick, who would like to address that?
Do you want to go, Patrick?
Yeah, thank you. So OHIP sets rates. The health ministry sets the rates that it will pay for every procedure specifically. Now, the Ministry of Health can go and adjust these rates. Bill 60, part of the problem with Bill 60 is that it is unclear whether or not rates can be split between, to have a different rate for private hospitals or public. So that's one piece. Another piece is that there's not only the procedures that are paid for through OHIP, there's also maintenance and administration and other pieces of that puzzle. So instead of putting our tax dollars into the maintenance, administration, and upgrading of our public spaces, it's using it to go and put in the pockets of private investors. So that is another way that funds are being diverted, regardless of the rates that OHIP has set.
We go back to the referendum. Sherry Bondi, Mayor of Essex, is asking, is there a way to vote if you cannot make it out in person? And I think I can answer that. So we're going to remind everybody to go to www.publichospitalvote.ca, and you can vote online, or you can see on there as well where the polling stations are. I appreciate, Patrick, that you mentioned earlier that you prefer to see people going out in person. And I didn't realize that. So I actually voted a couple of days ago, and I was pleasantly surprised how easy it was. So it's, just takes a couple of moments. So that was excellent. And let me just go on. Go ahead.
So any resident, 16 years of age or older, because at 16 years old, Ontarians can decide on the course of their medical treatment. So that is where we set the age at 16. So anyone 16 and older can go online or in person to vote. We ask that people sign a pledge, or in the online voting to click a box pledging that they are only voting once, and that they are a resident of Ontario and at least 16 years of age.
Thank you. I have a question from Fiona, and I think you touched a little on this, Patrick. She asks, do you think that Ontarians actually understand what proportion of our tax dollars supposedly are allocated for healthcare? Both provincial and federal health transfers are actually spent on health. And she says, for example, much of the much touted federal health transfer of February 2023, only about half of Ontario's share is required to be spent on health, 54 cents out of every healthcare dollar. So I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
After the, well, during the pandemic, at the end of the pandemic, the federal government provided to all provinces some additional funding. The Ford government, prior to this last election, was actually sitting on $6 billion that he could have put into healthcare funding. And they have not spent that on public health care or education, where some of the largest hits took place. Then we hear before the election that everyone's license plate fees for the last 2 years will be refunded. And we hear that we'll no longer have to pay those license plate fees. Okay, so now there's a lot of sharing back. But what was that money? Where did that money come from? Dalton McGuinty brought in, Ontarians need to pay a little extra in their provincial income tax in order to go and fund healthcare. And you know what? Hey, I didn't mind going to having that $600 a month or $600 a year taken out of my paycheck, on top of our provincial tax, on top of our federal income taxes, which are supposed to go back, a portion of which into our healthcare. So the government cutting per capita funding year after year after year. And when I say cutting, we're talking about real dollars against the cost of inflation. So it does go up a little bit in percentage, and they love to push the percentages because that's the only place where it goes up. This government is second to any other government in the last 50 years in per capita funding. Only the Harris government dropped per capita funding more than the Ford government. This is unacceptable. They're setting up the public system to fail so that they can sell what has been built by our grandparents and great-grandparents, so that they can sell that to the highest bidder. And quite frankly, to go and sell a public asset for a one-time one-off and lose it for generations to follow, that's kind of like, selling your house in order to pay the first 10 years of your mortgage. You're still going to have the next 10 years of your mortgage to pay. So not very wise. So yes, a number of sources of funding, and our control of it is being lost.
Thank you. Krista asks if it would be possible to post the QR code on the screen for those who'd like to vote digitally. And Patrick, I don't know if you can still share your screen with the QR code, but I do think that she makes a good point, and we're streaming this on Facebook Live. So after this webinar, we'll post the link to the site in the comments so that people can find it very easily. So we'll do that shortly after 8 o'clock, and we'll continue to share the the request to go vote over the weekend, so people can't forget. So we will take care of that. And I'd like to there was a comment from Kathy who says it's important for people to know that Ford didn't spend all the allotted money on COVID given by the feds, and that she does not think that most people are aware of this. Michael, Patrick, would either of you like to comment on that?
No, excellent point. Excellent point. And I mean, this is true generally. This is a government that is starving the institutional care sectors by withholding money. There's budget cuts in real terms, including in COVID, when we still have, significant outbreaks and people, residents in long-term care continue to die, for example, and in hospitals, withholding money which could be used to staff up or whatever. It's an example, I think, of a reluctance to invest. In a sense, it's an attempt to undermine the public hospital system, for example, because their goal really is to point to its dysfunctionality and say that the solution here needs to be to bring in a private sector to compensate for the inadequacies in it in addressing things like the backlog and stuff. So real budget cuts, withholding money, these are two of the instruments that they've been using. Hard to believe, eh?
That I think that your response is a very fine place to end this. We're 2 minutes before the end of this webinar, and I think that you really encapsulated the issues very well. So thank you very much, Patrick and Michael.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael and Patrick. You were wonderful speakers. Thanks to other members of Windsor on Watch for comments and hosting the meeting. A link will be sent to all attendees of this meeting because it's been recorded. You can also see it on Windsor on Watch Facebook and on YouTube. And we'd like to remind everyone that's attended to please vote either in person or online. And thank you all for attending.